Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I promised you counter-programming. This is counter-programming adjacent, because we'll probably get close to some contemporary punditry type things and some other stuff going on. But that's fine by me. I've been trying to get this guy on here for a very long time. You guys have heard me speak heap lavish praise on the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. And then there was the news that Ben Sasse is leaving the University of Florida, which bummed me out, mostly, but I was more bummed out for his own family travails. And it reminded me that I should get Will Inboden, who's the guy who actually runs the Hamilton Center. He rules with an iron fist, but it's couched in velvet. And he's also the author of a great book, which I have not read, but my wife loves, called The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. Will Inboden, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Jonah. Thank you for having me.
So we're not going to do this as a strict book tour thing, but we'll get to that. But just because a lot of people ask me, I mean, I'm friends with Ben Sasse, but I'm not as close to him as you are. You were professionally and personally close to him. When a normal person comes up to you and says, what the hell happened, or what's going on, or how's he doing? Like, just answer that question like a mention in a hotel lobby kind of question.
Sure. Yeah. So it is pretty straightforward. I mean, his wife's decline and health troubles going back to her stroke from a number of years ago have just become a lot more acute. And, I'd seen firsthand in the last few months the strain that it was putting on him and his leadership role at UF. And we're, personally close to the family. And so we all also saw the challenges they were facing there. And he made really the decision he had to make, which is to step aside from the job he loves a lot for the woman he loves infinitely more. He said to me at one point in coming to the decision that, this is what I meant in my marital vows when I said in sickness and in health. And those are words that flow across a lot of lips, but in this case, they're ones that he's really living out. So it's a huge loss for the university, I think, for higher ed overall, and we can talk about some of the implications there. But it's I've been telling a number of our students who've been asking about it that this is also, I think, a model of sometimes what it looks like to really have your priorities straight, right? I mean, so much what we're teaching and training our students for is to have impactful careers and make a difference in the world and to succeed professionally. And we all believe in that. I'm experiencing the pinnacle of my success right now being on the Remnant, right? So,
that's right. Aim low and you'll never be disappointed, dude.
That's right. So, but seriously, and obviously Ben is someone who's experienced, many successes in his life, and yet, family always has come first for him, and this came to a point where he realized he can't do both. He can't be the husband and father he needs to be right now with Melissa's health, and also to lead the institution he loves. And so, in that sense, it's a good example. I hope most others don't ever have to be in this situation, just as he would share that hope. But a good example of trying to have your priorities straight and of knowing the things that really are enduring and most meaningful in life. And sometimes we're forced to choose those and give up other things.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you probably speak to better than I, but I'm confident when I say it. One of the things people don't understand about Ben Sasse is that if he were like a normal college president, he could probably still do both. Mm-hmm. But Ben is one of these guys who is just going at 100 miles an hour for 14 hours a day kind of guy. I mean, he's one of those 110% commitment guys, and feeling like he was half-assing both home life and work life would it be a special kind of hell for him. I mean, so it makes sense in a lot of ways,
Yeah. And
the Joe Biden model of executive leadership, he could have pulled this off no problem. But, sleep late.
And we're seeing the problems with that too. Yeah. So, but it is, it's obviously a loss for the University of Florida, but I think it's a loss for the country. It's a loss for higher ed too, right? I mean, as you've You spoke with Ben about it on the show a few weeks ago, and you've been concerned for some time. There's this, growing crisis of legitimacy and crisis of confidence that Americans are having in our universities, and for good reason. I often say, I work at a university and I've lost confidence in higher ed, but he was, I think, becoming a real champion and national spokesman for a better way of returning to the more traditional values that universities were supposed to be. And so it leaves a void, but there's, I hope he set a certain standard that maybe some other university presidents can, across the country can now rise up to and champion that cause as well.
So, all right, let's talk about that then. I mean, so I have this thing about architects.
Mm-hmm.
I architects are one of these professions that I think has been kind of ruined because most architects don't actually care about what the public thinks of what they do. They only do their stuff to impress other architects and architecture critics, right? They're sort of deracinated, cut off. They're all Eloy to Eloy, no Eloy to Morlocks. They don't want to talk to the masses. They want to they kind of like being impenetrable and ununderstandable by the masses. And I feel like there's a very similar phenomenon going on with higher education, where higher education is caught in this bubble of academics and eggheads talking to each other and trying to impress each other, without actually doing the thing that they're there to do. And that's one of the reasons why I like the Hamilton Center so much, is it's not right wing per se or anything like that. It just, you guys keep hiring people who just want to do the actual job that most people think higher ed is supposed to be doing. And so where are you on your level of pessimism, optimism? I mean, I get that you guys are an island of not an island alone, sort of an island of a small archipelago. But are you bullish? Are you bearish on the future of higher ed? Where do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, well, I would say rather than bullish or bearish, maybe conflicted, right? I mean, I'm hopeful enough that I'm still working in higher ed and actually feel like we're doing some good things and advancing the ball with the Hamilton Center, and we can talk more later in the show about what that's looking like, and that we're not completely alone. There are similar efforts underway at a number of other universities. University of Texas, where I was for many years, is doing a great effort here. University of North Carolina, Ohio State has just announced one. Arizona State was a pioneer in this, and then the fact that as ghastly and awful as October 7th was, and frankly continues to be, it also exposed to a lot of the rest of the country what was some of the internal, festering ideological rot and radicalism of universities. And the rest of the country first needs to see and know what the problem is before we can, come together on solutions. It's kind of like the strategic shock it took to galvanize key parts of the country that now's the time that we need to do more significant reform in universities. And so having that awareness now, having that mobilization, and having some models of some solutions are causes for optimism. But there's still a lot of resistance. I mean, the problems with universities did not start on October 7th. They didn't start in 2020. They go back generations, and we're right now reaping the bitter fruits of a few decades or even a few generations of downstream drift in the universities. And on your point about architects only working or kind of designing buildings for each other, I think that's exactly right with universities, and that's been one of the problems. And bringing it back to Ben, one reason why he was, I think, really unique as a leading university president is he understood that the university president's job is to represent all the constituencies of the university, alumni, students, donors, and if you're a public university, citizens of the state. And that may sound like a banal observation, but one of the many dirty little secrets of higher ed is most university presidents, in their heart of hearts, see their job as really just representing their faculty. They often were faculty members. They rise up through the ranks of the faculty. That's the the ideological bubble and ecosystem they've swum in. And so they'll pay lip service to donors and alums and board members and all that, but they really see themselves as of the faculty and need to represent the faculty, and thus are very cautious and risk averse about getting crosswise with their faculty. And Ben coming in as a relative outsider, immediately saw like, wait, that's a fundamental problem if you see yourself only representing the faculty. A university is a public trust. He saw it as such. And so that's why when he was speaking out, he was mindful of, I need to speak out on behalf of parents, of students, of alums, of donors, of the citizens of Florida and of the United States. We're all stakeholders in higher ed. And so I think even with him departing the scene in his role as UF president, I know he'll continue to speak out on higher ed issues. And like I said, I hope it sets a model for other university presidents to understand that their job is representing a public trust and a much broader set of constituents. And that realization will be the first step to, I think, doing some more substantial reform to, whether it's, reining out control costs or bring more viewpoint diversity, or do more of a commitment to free speech and pluralism on campuses.
So if you could offer a 3-point plan to take University of Florida out of it, because presumably you have some influence there. But if you could just sort of come up with your top 3, these higher ed hacks will not solve all the problems, but they're the lowest hanging doable things, lowest hanging fruit available right now for elite colleges. What would they be?
Yeah. Okay. You're putting me on the spot here, but I'll try to rattle off a few that may work. The first one would be encouraging universities to start new academic units within the university, a college or a school or something like that, devoted to what the Hamilton Center is doing, right? Devoted to research and teaching in Western civilization. Again, that may sound banal, but let me highlight a few features of that, which will show why I think it would be necessary. Most of the ideological crisis in universities comes from the humanities and social sciences, and maybe some adjacent like policy schools, education schools, right? The problems are not the engineering colleges, okay? They may not be perfect, but they're generally empirical, rational, and less susceptible to the ideological fevers of the day. So when you see crazy stuff going on in universities, it's usually emanating from humanities and social sciences. But the way university governance works, it's called shared governance or self-governance, meaning that the faculty have often the most or the final say on hiring their successors and hiring their colleagues. And there's just a problem so it's a self-governing institution, but when a self-governing institution goes into a rut, right, or drifts into mediocrity, pick your problem. It's really hard to depend on the same people who drove it into the rut to then drive it out of the rut, to correct it. There needs to be some sort of new entity or outside pressure to come and say, hey, that we need to do something different here. And so that's why starting new units, which can hire their own faculty, within the university, rather than relying on the English department to all of a sudden, hire more conventional faculty, or the history department to start offering more classes in military and diplomatic history instead of everything always being about race and gender. You see these problems. That would be a first start, and the others can still exist alongside, but it creates just a little bit more of a competition of ideas on campus, and it will spark competition, more mundane competition for student enrollments, right? See, the students will vote with their feet. They're going to want to take more meaningful, interesting classes. So that would be one. The second is I would do, I'm still a believer in tenure. I can tell you all the problems with tenure as a tenured faculty myself, and I'm still a believer in it. But I do think there needs to be a little bit of a modification or check on balance. And that's one thing we've been doing in Florida, something called post-tenure review, which is, every 5 to 10 years after a professor has been tenured, you do a review and make sure just is he or she still being productive, right? Because too often a professor will become tenured and then will quit publishing and will become much more indifferent on their teaching, and just becomes this lifetime sinecure, and it's very, very inefficient. But also just it encourages more complacency and lack of accountability. So we still need tenure to protect real academic freedom, but not to protect productivity. So that would be a second one. And the third one would be severely reining in the administrative bloat. I worked before I became a professor. I worked for a number of years for the federal government, the national security field, and I find university bureaucracies even slower and less efficient and more kind of absurdly Orwellian than the federal government bureaucracy. And and that is saying something. So those would be three starters. I'm sure there's others I could add.
Yeah, I mean, it's like University of Florida is weird insofar as, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way. It's cheap, and what I mean is it's affordable,
Yeah.
and but you have a lot of schools that are. I mean, it seems to me that some of the problems that we have with higher ed are very similar to problems that we have with healthcare in this country. The connection between the price tag and the payer is kind of been muddied through all sorts of different things. And like I have a friend, you know him too, but I'll leave his name out of it, who's probably, his daughter is probably the only person I know who does this. She goes to Princeton, and she doesn't cut class because she did the math on how much her parents are paying per class. And and she felt it would be irresponsible to cut class. But this environment we now have with forgiving student loan, for racking up student loans, for creating an incentive structure for schools to constantly increase the price of tuition, which I know Alex Tabarrok says is largely because of Baumol disease, but I don't buy it entirely. Is there anything that can be done there at scale? I mean, it doesn't seem like you can replicate the University of Florida for every school out there, but it's just like the checks I am paying for my daughter to go to a elite school are sobering. I'll just put it that way. And I don't like to be sobered.
Yeah. No, this is look, smarter people than I have spent a lot more time on the pricing problem and the cost of runs to the university. So again, I'm not going to have the perfect solution there, but you do highlight, one, University of Florida is an outlier, and if there are any Florida citizens or residents listening to this, you'll appreciate this. In-state tuition at UF is only $6,000 a year, and that's a cap mandated by the state. And this is for a top 25, top 30 university, one of the top 5 publics, right? It's an extraordinarily good deal. And it's even relatively cheaper for out-of-state students. But that's made possible, as Ben often put it when he's president, like UF is losing a lot of money on the students we're educating, because it does cost more than $6,000 a year for the university to educate a student. But that's made up by, very generous support and subsidies from the state of Florida. So even though we're overall a politically conservative state, a small government state, we've got the population bigger than New York, but half as many public employees as the state of New York. The governor and legislature have done a great job to keep that in. Florida is not, small government, low spending when it comes to higher ed. And I as a conservative, is not a libertarian, I believe some things are worth spending on, and higher ed is absolutely it. But not every state can afford to do this. And so what you have is this unsustainable model of the extremely wealthy families are still generally able to afford to pay full fare. Extremely wealthy universities such as Princeton, Harvard, and Stanford can offer for lower income families essentially a full ride. But those in the middle are absolutely squeezed. They're not getting enough financial aid, but they don't have the means to pay the full price. Again, reining in the administrative load would certainly be one step there. Just some sort of more accurate pricing mechanism, as you're saying. I think the analogy to kind of just our Byzantine healthcare system is certainly apt. And then it's incumbent on universities to show more value for what we're doing, right? I mean, I think some of the public outrage and loss of confidence in universities, and why we've had this kind of broken social contract between the public and universities, is because families are realizing we're paying these exorbitant amount of money, but we don't feel like we're getting that value in return, especially in the humanities and social sciences. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do with Hamilton, is kind of bring a new sense of value to teaching humanities and social sciences. And so these can be meaningful and enriching for your education, and also lead you to a viable career path.
Just, one quick point on the whole, you guys have half the public sector employees than the state of New York does. In fairness, about half of New York's public sector employees are actually living in Florida, taking a paycheck from New York. So it kind of evens out.
And they're not paying income taxes in Florida because we don't have income taxes. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. No, I remember Fred Siegel once made the case that New York City has 2 fire departments. The the fire department that is actually working and putting out fires, and the firemen who are on workman's comp living in Florida half the year. All right, so let's just change gears just a little bit for a second. You're a before you became a suit in academia and all that kind of stuff, you're a Reagan guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Reagan guy. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything about Reagan. Doesn't mean uh, you can't have differing views about different circumstances today and all that kind of stuff. But I'm a big um, I'm a big proponent of adapting Reaganite principles to today's problems, not replaying the
Mm-hmm.
Reagan playbook per se, because
Mm-hmm.
the world's a different place than it was when Reagan was president, right? Um, what do you make of the way in which sort of the Reagan legacy and Reaganism, zombie Reaganism, and all of these sorts of things? Um, what do you make of the way in which big chunks of the GOP and the right these days have decided to sort of denigrate, downplay, ignore, um, or recontextualize, to be very diplomatic, Reagan?
Yeah, I think it's a big loss. I mean, I again, as a certainly a professing Reaganite like you, I think the Reaganite birthright is a valuable inheritance bequeathed to the GOP, and let's not be like Esau and jettison it for a pot of porridge. And again, as you said, that extolling the Reagan legacy and holding it up as having some relevance for today is not zombie Reaganism, right? Anytime you hear someone saying that, and you grab your wallet, it's a cheap talking point that's evading, really wrestling with the issues. And it's not just about a one for one transfer of whatever his particular economic policies would have been to what ours are now. He did have some different circumstances, but I think some common threads are one. He did put ideas at the role of ideas at the forefront of his political campaigns and his presidency. Certainly most of my book is about the role of foreign policy ideas and his ideas about the superiority of democratic capitalism over Soviet communism and seeing the Cold War as a battle of ideas. But he also put ideas at the forefront of his domestic policy. Again, ideas about limited government, about restoring some sense of self government to the people against an overweening federal bureaucracy, ideas about opportunity and upward mobility. Ideas about adhering to the Constitution, right? If you look at the originalist revolution, which really kind of starts a lot of ways in the Reagan Justice Department rather than in a faculty lounge of a particular law school. Even ideas about the social conservatism. Reagan was not a militant culture warrior by any means, but he was more of a social conservative than is often appreciated. It's a little, in fact, he's I'm pretty sure still the only president to have published a book while in office. And that book he wrote came out in 1984. It's called Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation. It's more of a booklet sort of book, but it's his kind of a effort at public persuasion for the pro-life cause, because he did take that seriously. And so putting ideas at the forefront, and then in turn taking persuasion as seriously as mobilization, right? Reagan was not someone who wanted to just get 50.1% of the vote. He wanted to persuade as many Americans as possible to get behind him. So sure, he could, throw red meat and rally the base of the best of them, and that's a part of politics, and one we can, I even find inspiring sometimes. But he was always thinking about how do I get that supermajority? How do I persuade the skeptics or the fence sitters or the opponents to join my cause and get behind me? And the results there speak for themselves as far as the really strong public consensus that came behind most of his policies, and why he wins such an overwhelming reelection in 1984. So the ideas and public persuasion part, I think, is really important. And then the other one is optimism, right? I mean, one of the things that I find most dispiriting about our contemporary moment is the lack of optimism and hope for the future. And optimism doesn't have to be delusion. I mean, this is, Reagan, he was very clear eyed about the threats and challenges and problems he confronted in taking office. Things may feel bad now, but, 1980 was much worse, right? We were coming on several years of economic recession, high unemployment, high inflation, stagflation, humiliation from the OPEC oil embargo, the energy crisis, a demoralized and weakened military, and just a really demoralized and weakened nation, a country that thought, our best days were behind us. Americans were not hopeful for the future then. And so rather than pandering to that pessimism and reinforcing it, Reagan tried to sketch out the possibility of a better future. He wasn't deluded about it. He still wanted to connect with the American people and understand and empathize with the struggles they had, to say, hey, things can get better. Our better days can be ahead. And at least then Americans rallied to that particular vision. And that's why he got, the Reagan Democrats emerged, right? I mean, he was one of the original populists. He just did it in a more, I think, effective way of appealing to, disaffected blue collar workers who traditionally would have voted Democrat because of the labor unions. So he showed you could mobilize those populist energies, but just channel them in a more constructive direction with policies that did make a difference for people. So there would be the general outlines of my plea. I'm sure you'd have some thoughts on this too.
No, I agree with all that. For obvious reasons, I think that the let's put it this: I find very few, very on the, we'll call it the new right, which has many. There are many rooms in the mansion of the new right. There are some nationalists, there are some post-liberals, there are some total goobers, there's some serious people who are just confused and blah 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 blah. Right? Almost to a person, their critiques of Reagan, first of all, strike me mostly as caricature. Or straw men, and also, I have this thing where the present can change the past, insofar as our understanding of what was prologue in the past changes based on contemporary events. So, like after 9/11, all of a sudden, for most of our lives, 1917 was like this inflection point year in human history, and then all of a sudden it was probably 1922 or whenever it was that the Wahhabis took over Saudi Arabia, right? And it's like all of a sudden these things that seemed like secondary or tertiary stories in the past become primary. And I think, when you see some of the people attacking Reagan these days for agreeing to an immigration amnesty, they are projecting backwards today's issues that had a very different valence, that the future had not happened yet, right? I mean, when Reagan did his amnesty, it was in exchange for all sorts of assurances and promises. Maybe he was foolish to accept the assurances, but he made a political deal about how this would be a one-time thing. The other side didn't, fulfill it, but people who have a sort of thumbless grasp of the history, they just say, well, he started us down the path on amnesty, and it's really just a way of using contemporary issues to reframe the past in ways that I don't find very persuasive. But I do think, one of the points you made about, trying to persuade people, if you go back and you watch Reagan's old speeches and stuff, he doesn't really say Democrat very often, right? He doesn't, there are a couple of jokes that he's told that, where he does Democrat thing, like gridiron kind of things. But like basically he just tells stories that people, regardless of their partisan or ideological affiliations, have access to because they're stories. And that approach to politics is so lacking today. And it's weird because I agree with you, who's a guy who cared a lot about ideas, but he did not convey ideas by getting abstract. He conveyed ideas by telling stories about the human experience, which is the way our brains are actually designed to receive information, is you tell a story. And that art is almost completely gone among our politicians today.
Yeah, absolutely. The stories and the jokes, right? Because he knew that, in the silly witticism or the telling joke would often be a multitude of political truths. And yet he's not Professor Reagan standing up there expounding these abstractions about political truths about, the nature of the individual and the state and something like that. But he's just, telling stories that anyone can relate to. And yet those stories or those jokes, move them to a point of seeing where he wants to go politically. And I'm glad you brought up the immigration part. Yeah, because this is where his record, I think, has been unfairly distorted. I don't do much on immigration in my book because it's primarily about foreign policy. But immigration is one of those issues that connects foreign and domestic policy, and it comes up a few times. And one thing I was really struck by is as president of the United States, Reagan never forgot that he had before that been the two-term governor of a border state of California, and he had dealt,
Right.
very much with the illegal immigration problem even in the 60s and 70s. And he, of course, maintained good relations with his fellow border state governors while he was in the White House. And so he was very clear in his diaries and his private correspondence when they were negotiating the 86 Immigration Reform Act that border security had to come first. I mean, he was, very clear on that. We need to secure the border. I've lived firsthand the problem of a unsecure border. But he paired that as well with a belief in legal immigration as overall a good thing and a strength for the country. Both because of how it replenishes our workforce and brings in people, eager to contribute to America, who believe in our dream. He believes in America as an idea, rather than a blood and soil kind of old world tribal identity. And he also knew that it was America's openness to legal immigration is a huge weapon in the battle of ideas in the Cold War. He'd often point out one way you can just tell the legitimacy or illegitimacy of a regime is, are the people trying to get in it or get out of it? The Berlin Wall was not built to keep people out; it was built to keep them in, right, as a prison, right? That's why the Soviet Union wouldn't allow freedom of immigration, especially for the Jews, and why Reagan was such a champion for the refuseniks, the Soviet Jews who wanted to emigrate to Israel or the United States. And so he held on to both of those principles. If we need border security, but then that will enable us to have a more regularized immigration system where the American people can feel like we have some ownership on this, that our country controls its borders and can decide who will come in, because that we can allow more people in. The law failed in its implementation. Essentially, once Congress passed the law, it had the border security provisions, which our government, post Reagan, just failed catastrophically to enforce. And so that had been some of the grand bargain he was willing to take of, the amnesty or regularizing the people who are already here illegally to kind of reset things, and then build a better system going forward. So, we can fault him for perhaps not paying, and it was the last year or two of his presidency, but we can fault him for not paying a little more attention on the implementation, but not for, I think, getting the policy wrong.
So, John Patrick Diggins, intellectual historian who I have a love-hate relationship with, he wrote a book on Reagan, and he basically tried to claim Reagan as essentially a liberal, like a classical liberal, but like an American liberal in the great American tradition, of sort of the liberal consensus that Lionel Trilling was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
He considered Reagan to be part of that sort of tradition. And then you have other people who've argued that he really wasn't an ideologue at all. He was a pragmatist who, you know, put tariffs on, was a free trader, but when he needed to, he put tariffs on Harley Davidson, on motorcycles of a certain size to save Harley Davidson. All sorts of things with he was a great anti-communist, but he got a lot of deals, and worked with Gorbachev. And you can go down a list of these sorts of things. My defense of the pragmatist thing has always been there's nothing inherently wrong or contradictory or hypocritical or inconsistent about being idealistic about ends but pragmatic about means. And politics is the art of the possible, and you do what you can where you can, and this idea of making the perfect the enemy of the good is one of the reasons why our current politics stuck so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And on the liberal thing, I bristled at that in my younger years. and now I'm very sympathetic to it because I think the classical liberal element of conservatism is the thing that is most under siege these days. And embracing that part of the Reagan legacy and Reaganism, I think, is something to lean into more. But so how do you see Reagan in that context? Do you see him as a classical liberal? Do you think classical liberalism and conservatism are complementary, spelt correctly, or are they, in conflict? How do you see it?
Yeah, no, great question. And this is where, Reagan is in some ways so much of a Rorschach test, right? Because you can read because he is so complex, you can read almost any number of things. And yeah, parts of him are pragmatic, as I talk about in the book. I share your affinity for that John Patrick Diggins biography of Reagan. I think it's something like Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Meaning of History, some big, academic-y title. And the Diggins book is
Yeah.
important because it came out like 20 years ago. I think it was one of the first books about Reagan to take Reagan seriously as a man of ideas, right? Diggins was an intellectual historian, and he was one of the first ones to say, hey, Reagan's just more than just this kind of charismatic political figure, that there is a core of ideas there, not an intellectual in the traditional sense, but certainly takes ideas seriously. And he locates Reagan in the classical liberal tradition. He was also one of the first scholars to take Reagan's Christian faith seriously, which is also very important to understanding Reagan. A little idiosyncratic in some ways, but it's still very, very much there. I at the end of the day, I would still locate Reagan as a traditional three-stool conservative, or three legs of the stool, right? A fusionist, of a national security hawk, a social conservative, and a free market classical liberal. And so all three of those elements coexist with him, but he's not doing it as an abstract intellectual, writing long treatises. He's doing it as a political leader who's also always thinking about the art of the possible and how do I advance the ball and get things done. And so, taken as a whole, I still think he identifies most as a traditional conservative. But that is, as you were saying, traditional conservatism rooted in classical liberalism, right? So he's a pluralist, even though he's very very encouraging of public expressions of religious faith and the role of religion in the public square. He's not trying to, sacralize Christianity as the state religion of the United States, for example. Even though he's, fierce in defending his own views, he also is, committed to defending the views of his opponents and to disagreeing civilly, certainly within American political discourse. And thinking about some of the new right voices these days who are very disparaging of Reagan and his legacy, their forebears were very disparaging of Reagan at the time in office, right? I mean, even though he's, I think, rightly regarded as a conservative icon, the most political heat he got during his time in office wasn't so much from the New York Times editorial page or Teddy Kennedy and the Democrats. Yeah, they were fighting him sometimes. It was often from human events. The at the time very influential conservative weekly or biweekly. His biggest adversary on Capitol Hill, again, wasn't Ted Kennedy or even Tip O'Neill, it was Jesse Helms, the arch conservative Republican senator from North Carolina. Helms and Reagan agreed on some things, but Helms was constantly giving Reagan grief for, not being militantly conservative enough, according to Helms. And it wasn't just rhetorical stuff. I mean, Helms was constantly putting holds on Reagan's nominees because they didn't meet Helms's standards. And so, so Reagan was no stranger to that sort of heat and opposition from the hard right. But one of his lines, I'm paraphrasing here, was something to the effect of like, look, I will always stick by my principles, but I'm also one of these guys. If I can get an 80% deal where I get 80% of what I wanted, I'm not going to be one who goes, screaming and flying off the cliff because I didn't get the final 20% I wanted. And so that's why, if you just look at his governance record of how he was able to move the ball on, whether it's tax cuts or tighten money or increased defense budget, or for the most part, judicial appointments. Some of his obviously appointees were better than others, or a tougher posture towards the Soviet Union or any number of other, Mexico City policy on abortion. He did get a lot done for the conservative cause. I mean, I think he's easily the most unequivocally successful conservative president we've had of probably since Calvin Coolidge. Not a perfect record on that front, but certainly shows how you get a lot more done, and yet doing it within the American classical liberal political order.
So I was talking to somebody recently, and he told me a new Reagan line that I'd never heard before, which was talking about when Reagan, in the context of Reagan losing his temper politically, and he said, "Look, I always throw my golf clubs in the direction I'm walking anyway," which I just thought was sort of great.
Yeah. I hadn't heard that one before. I thought I heard them all. That's a new one for me too. I like that. Yeah.
So one of my, I used to say this to conservative audiences back when I was in good odor, and was the after dinner speaker for all sorts of right wing groups. And I always used to say, hey, look, have some confidence, right? Like if you think your positions are right, events will prove that you are right. So don't have like this, this momentary despair because you lost an election or some law passes that you don't like. If the law is based on bad ideas, the law won't work, and we'll be able to, prove and use that as ammo to get the right law. As Edmund Burke says, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other. And sometimes you have to show people, not just tell people. And like, as a Hayekian guy, we just know that markets work better than command economies. So if we go to a command economy stuff, it will fail. We'll get to say, I told you so. And then we'll get to sort of improve things. And it was always an exhortation to look beyond just the next election, to play the long game. That's why, the kind of stuff that you guys are doing, I think matters more than, a lot of the election hysteria and all that kind of thing. And I believe that sincerely. I really do. I'm not a full blown Whig. I don't think there's a teleology to this stuff, but I do think that if you base your political program on the idea that 2 + 2 is 7, it's going to fail, and the people who base it on 2 + 2 is 4 are going to succeed over time, right? And the place where I used to be much more confident about that was on foreign policy, and I would look at the remarkable continuity in American foreign policy between presidents. No one on the left or the right wants to hear it, but the continuity between Obama and Trump or Bush and Obama is much stronger than you think it is on all sorts of fronts. Doesn't mean there weren't mistakes. Doesn't mean I agree with everything anybody did. I'm just saying that, like, if you're a historian 100 years from now looking back, you're going to say, well, the realists have a half a point about America's, interests really guiding its foreign policy in ways that may not seem like it in the heat of a partisan battle. I worry about that more now, and I know this is a stem winder of a question, but I worry about it more now because we don't have the luxury to learn from bad mistakes the way we do in domestic policy. Like, rent control sucks. Rent control always proves itself not to work, and we'll fix it and that kind of thing. Or legalizing drugs. Every time some city does it, middle class leaves, downtowns become garbage, and they say, oh, that was a mistake, and they fix it.
Yeah.
Like, Israel's on knife's edge, right? If they have a full-blown war with Hezbollah, I mean, it's going to be a full-blown war with Iran. Ukraine does not have a lot of margin of error, and we saw the stakes for Afghanistan. When you think about what the foreign policy looks like in the next 10 years, with Taiwan and all the rest, it feels like that in some ways politics matters more. And I'm a big anti-catastrophizer, but I could see with either of these choices, really terrible things happening, different terrible things, but terrible things happening in foreign policy. I mean, how do you think about it in that context?
Yeah, no, I'll affirm your angst there, right? I feel a lot of it too, and also I think starting with your basic insight of policies that in the long run aren't going to work, right? And so the question is
Right.
then, do they fail in a way that doesn't destroy the country and the world? It can at least be recovered, even if there's tremendous costs that we've incurred, or do they fail in a really catastrophic way? And this is where as a historian, can turn and look back on history and take some hope, but also see that the cost can be real. And I'll trace this back to Reagan too. So the 1930s are obviously the iconic decade of showing that protectionism and isolationism don't work. Because American protectionism takes our Great Depression and then oversimplified leads to worldwide depression, right? And then American isolationism, allows the way for aggression of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Again, it's a little bit of a potted history, but that's essentially the truth. And so because those policies don't work, we then have to abandon the protectionism and then enter World War II and eventually help lead the Allies to victory. But my goodness, at what tremendous ghastly cost. And that was a very formative decade for Reagan, too. I mean, that's one of the things I was struck by in studying his foreign policy as president, is he's constantly referring back to the lessons of the 1930s and 40s, because those were his coming of age years. So bringing it forward to him, similarly, it's often forgotten that he ran for president twice before he wins in 1980. He has a short-lived campaign challenging Nixon in 68 for the Republican nomination, and then again, more robustly in 76, challenging Ford for the Republican nomination. You can see some common principles that Reagan was running on both times. But the Republican primary voters, the American people, weren't ready for it, right? He doesn't get selected, and so the kind of the Nixon, Kissinger, Ford foreign policy, which had some real successes too. Let's give some credit there, but also fundamentally, I think misread the Soviets and believed that this détente, that this accommodation could be made with the Soviet Union. When in fact, as we see through Jimmy Carter's presidency, when he considers those policies, Soviet Union was essentially pocketing our concessions and taking more, right? And that's when the Soviet Union hits the apex of its international strength, sponsoring communist revolutions across the global south, increasing its military strength, invading Afghanistan. And that's when finally, Reagan wins 1980, his third time trying for president, in large part because those policies had failed that he'd been arguing against. And it is a perilous time, but fortunately, the Soviet Union had not yet won the Cold War. The United States had not yet lost the Cold War. And so he had a chance to come in and change course. So similarly today, I don't think policies of abandoning our allies or using extortionate methods against Taiwan and South Korea over our military support for them, or cutting off Ukraine, or being weak-kneed in our support for Israel, as the Biden administration has been. I don't think those are answers, and they are making the world a more dangerous place. From this kind of what I've taken to call this new Eurasian belt of tyranny. Right? There's different labels for it, but it's essentially this Russia, China, Iran, North Korea axis. I'm not terribly confident in either ticket right now, having the seriousness and the foreign policy vision and convictions, to navigate those threats. I hope that the cost doesn't become too great on it. And sometimes events themselves will have a way of forcing someone's hand. I'm quite critical of Biden on a lot of foreign policy fronts, but he's at least had going back to your continuity theory, at least had some continuity with Trump on China. Right, both have had a much more assertive confrontational posture towards China, which we need. And I think neither of them 10, 20 years ago would have thought that that's where they'd get, but kind of China made that choice for us.
Yeah, I mean that's in the long run. I think my point about domestic stuff will apply to foreign policy stuff too. At the end of the day, the world is divided up into basically three groups: the sort of non-aligned countries, most of which don't matter that much to us, our enemies, and our friends.
Yeah.
and history shows that you tend to sort of hang out with your friends. And I wish we were, the idea that allies are bad just strikes me as one of the single dumbest, widely accepted ideas on the right these days. I mean, just as a whether it's foreign policy or domestic politics or whatever, just like the idea that you wouldn't want a larger coalition rather than a smaller coalition. And I'm someone who's, I used to beat the crap out of Democrats' foreign policy all the time by saying they'd rather be um, wrong in a big group than right alone. But like, I wasn't trying to make the case that it's better just to be alone. You want to convince people to join you because allies are force multipliers. And the willingness of smart people to absorb Trump's rhetoric about alliances and NATO and all of that and pretend that it's very sophisticated and smart is one of the gaslightier feelings gaslightier things on the right these days that it's very hard for me to take it as a straight-faced argument from a lot of people.
Yeah, no, strong foot stomp of agreement there, and it's 2 points to elaborate on that. I mean, the first is, for any of our listeners who may still doubt the value of allies, and I know you're out there because Jonah's got a broad range of listeners, right? Consider it from the bad guy's perspective, right? If America's allies are such a drain on us and such a liability for us, why do Putin and Xi Jinping spend almost every waking moment on their part trying to divide us from our allies? Like, why and peel our allies off from us?
Right.
Because they see our allies as a source of strength, right? They don't have any real allies. They're kind of forging this weird, Russia China entente. They ultimately don't like or trust each other, and they certainly don't have any real allies as far as technically being a formal treaty ally is one where each country signed a treaty to come to the other's self defense, right? So it's a formal commitment that it transcends individual leaders, and that's what gives it its potency. This was the case in the Cold War. The Soviets were always trying to drive wedges between the United States and our allies. China is always today trying to drive wedges between us and our Asian allies, right? So the bad guys have a vote. Look how they're voting. They clearly see our allies as a source of strength. In this case, I think they're right. But the second point is, going back to continuity in American foreign policy. Here's one for you. Every single American president from Harry Truman on up to Joe Biden, and this includes Donald Trump, has had one thing in common when it comes to allies. They've been mad at the allies for not spending enough on their own defense, right? This is a common lament. I can join every single one, right? Yeah, because the allies, they are imperfect. You can't live with them, can't live without them, and they do need to spend more on their defense. But the difference is, the American, and yes, I'll bring it back to Reagan, the American president who was most successful in getting the allies to step up and spend more on their defense wasn't Trump. He did somewhat, although there's a real cost. It was Reagan. And Reagan did do it by publicly threatening and humiliating the allies. In public, he would praise them and reassure them. But then in private, and I've read the transcripts of just about all of his his private meetings with every allied head of state. He'd grab them and he'd hug them. And he'd hug them really tight. And he'd kind of squeeze them around the neck. And he'd say, Helmut, if it's Helmut Kohl in West Germany, Maggie, if it's Thatcher, Yasu, if it's Yasuhiro Nakasone in Japan. Look what I'm doing to essentially dramatically increase America's defense spending. I'm doing it because of our commitment to our country and to our treaty. You need to do the same. Right. So he would cajole them. He'd do it in private. He wouldn't humiliate them. And it worked. So Japan, over the 8 years of Reagan's presidency, Japan triples its defense spending in real dollars, right? Massive increase. They hadn't increased their defense spending like that since the 1930s when they were on one of the bad guys, right? And it was because they saw that Reagan was leading and they wanted to be a part of it, and they trusted him, and they wanted to do their part for the alliance. And so one can share the lament about Allied lack of burden sharing or free riding, but there's a much more constructive way to address it. And that's why we have seen over the last few years, NATO, we're now, I think 2/3 of NATO allies are hitting their 2% targets, which they needed to be. That wasn't primarily from Trump cajoling them. It was primarily from Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine.
I know you got a heart out for you, but so one of the things that sort of defined Reagan was he accepted that the Soviet Union could be defeated, right? And that was the sharp break with the sort of Nixon Kissinger kind of foreign policy. moving from detente to we win, you lose kind of thing. And I think part of it stemmed from his metaphysics, right? His actual belief that tyranny cannot sustain itself perpetually. The human heart wants to be free, and we can debate whether that all of that is correct or not. But one of the prevailing positions on a lot of the right, including among a lot of people I actually respect and think are very smart, is that our bet on bringing China into the world order and into the global trading system failed. And that it failed because China did not liberalize the way people thought it would. It actually used the proceeds from its embrace of quasi markets and all of that to solidify the apparatus of the police state. And my own view is that it hasn't worked out yet. All right. And I'm not saying it's going to. I'm not saying like that Jeffersonian democracy is around the corner or anything like that. But totalitarian systems or quasi-totalitarian systems are very opaque. They're very strong, but they're also very brittle, right? They're more like marble, right? They're not anti-fragile. And so there are a lot of people who make this sort of straight line projection into the future that China's going to be an adversary, a gargantuan adversary for generations to come, that Xi-ism is a permanent fixture. And I just don't buy it. I'm not saying they're all wrong. I'm just not persuaded that they're all right, because history never moves forward in a straight line. And all the people who say, well, you can have steady state systems of totalitarianism for a very long time, they're right. But the thing that's different now is it's very difficult to have them with rich people. It's very easy to keep poor people miserable for very long periods of time. It's, but you get the Enlightenment era revolutions because you get middle classes that want to, have their rights. And the experiment that China's doing is just simply a new experiment. They got some things on their that help them and some things that hurt them, but like it's just different. So people looking to history to say history proves that this is going to last forever, or history proves that this isn't going to last forever. I just don't think history has a lot to tell us per se about what's going on with China. But I kind of feel like Reagan would be on my side about the very least about still saying these people are not, this country is not going to supplant the United States as the global, superpower, leader of the, enlightened countries of the world, or any of that kind of stuff. And so anyway, I'm just sort of wondering where you come down on China and how you think Reagan would see it today.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. I'll try to highlight a few thoughts, and the first would be to again be in general agreement with your diagnosis. I mean, I'm certainly of two minds. I can make the case for China's ongoing strength and resilience, but also for its brittleness and vulnerability. If pushed, I tend to emphasize the brittleness and vulnerability a little bit more. I don't know that this regime will still be there 50 years from now. I don't even know it'll be there 20 years from now. I'm not making a firm prediction one way or another, but I'm not confident in its longevity. But thinking historically, or say as a general matter, and then I'll pivot back up around to the Reagan questions. China, the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party today are an N of one, as the political science would say, right? We've never before in human history had this particular phenomenon we have now of a Leninist party state, a large Leninist party state, successfully reforming its economy somewhat to survive, and then staying in power. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but we just you can't point to, well, the last 10 times we had one of these, here's how it turned out 8 times, right?
Right.
We've never had this before. Nor have we had this situation before when this gets to the US-China competition of where two great powers in the world have been each other's main security rivals, as we are with China, and also each other's main economic partners. We've never had this before too, as we have with the US and China now, and that's why we're rightly going through the decoupling or the partial decoupling. So with Reagan, a really interesting vignette that I uncovered in my book, which I think tells a lot about how and why the Soviet Union and China went different paths thus far. Is the notable Chinese Communist Party reformist leader was Deng Xiaoping, right? When he comes to power in kind of the 78-79 window and opens up the market reforms, that's when the Chinese economy does start to go on that incredible 3-decade long growth spurt. And then Mikhail Gorbachev becomes a Soviet leader in 1985. In 1986, a year into Gorbachev's rule, 7 years into Deng Xiaoping's rule, Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, visits Beijing, and he meets with Deng Xiaoping. And Schultz sits down with Deng Xiaoping. He says, all right, so you're a communist reformist leader. This new guy, Gorbachev, in the Soviet Union is a communist reformist leader. Tell me, Deng, what do you think of Gorbachev? And Deng Xiaoping makes a very interesting and frankly prophetic observation. He tells Schultz, Gorbachev is getting it all wrong. Gorbachev is trying to do political reform, of open up the Soviet political system to make it more, transparent and responsive to its people, without reforming the economy. And that's not going to work because he's going to raise the Soviet people's expectations of a better life, but not really be able to deliver it to them. Deng says, we're doing the opposite here in China. I'm maintaining firm one-party rule. This is a guy who 5 years later orders the Tiananmen Square massacre. So he, showed grimly what he meant by this. But we're opening up the economy so the Chinese people will have more food to eat and better lives for themselves. And in the medium term, Deng Xiaoping's prediction was correct, right? Soviet Union collapses a few years later, partly from Gorbachev, mostly from Reagan, I think, but it's not the main point. And here we are now in the year 2024, and the Chinese Communist Party still has its monopoly on power. However, going back to some of the points you were making, we do have to ask how sustainable this is, right? A line I've used before, and I think is true, is when Xi Jinping puts his head on his pillow every night, the main thing keeping him up isn't necessarily his worries about the United States and as an adversary. What keeps him up at night is he's most afraid of his own people. This is why China invests, untold hundreds of billions in the most massive surveillance state any country has ever constructed in world history, right? To restrict what the Chinese people can see on social media, to monitor what they may be thinking. I mean, it really is this Orwellian nightmare. Well, if you are so afraid of your people that you invest so much in monitoring and controlling them, that doesn't say much about the confidence and durability of your regime. Then you add to that, the demographic disaster that they're sitting on, which our mutual friend and your colleague Nick Eberstadt has done so much good work on, right? The double whammy of the aging population and the sex ratio imbalances of so many more boys than girls because of their sex-selective abortion, and the tremendous economic imbalances within their economy. The real estate bubble. Lack of domestic consumption. So there are a number of ingredients there showing this is a brittle, fragile regime, afraid of its own people, and probably not able to keep its own bargain with its people going of, we will make you richer if you give up your freedoms for us. The people gave up the freedom and they're not feeling like they're getting richer anymore. But as you point out earlier, enough of them have become richer thus far that you do have, pretty, sizable Chinese middle class. Usually, historically, when a prosperous middle class develops, they do want more freedoms in their own lives. This is a large part of the story of South Korea's democratic transition in 87, of Taiwan's democratic transition, Chile's democratic transition, right? So, I can certainly tell a plausible story about this being a pretty brittle, fragile regime. Still a very dangerous one. Sometimes the most dangerous regimes are brittle, fragile ones that happen to have hundreds of nuclear weapons, right? So that, the next few years, another one of your AEI colleagues and my friend Hal Brands and Mike Beckley wrote that really good book, Danger Zone, saying that, the next 5 years may be the most critical window in the U.S.-China relationship, precisely because China has hit its peak and may be declining, and they may want to lash out or be more aggressive.
All right, my friend. I know I promised I would get you out in time to go do your Master of the Universe academic stuff, so I will set you free. But I hope you come back, and I really do want to congratulate you on all the incredible work you're doing down there, at the Hamilton Center and at the University of Florida, and I wish you nothing but luck.
Well, thank you very much. If I could just, close with a quick final plug here, because you've been such a great, friend and booster to the Hamilton Center. We're still alive and kicking, right? We're still strong and growing, and even though it's a loss for not to have Ben Sasse our president anymore, our the board of trustees and state leaders are very supportive, and we've just announced 25 new faculty positions that we're hoping to fill. So we just put those jobs up. So if there's any junior or senior scholars out there who are remnant listeners, that would likely make you a good candidate for us. Doing good work on in any of the humanities and social science fields. If you're committed to research and teaching and on Western civilization, that's our mission. So go to our website, check out the ads, and think about joining our merry team. We're having a great time in Gainesville, Florida, and continue to grow and build out the cohort.
Yeah, I mean that's my only major. I mean, I went down and visited you guys, and my only major complaint is it's in Gainesville, Florida, but there's nothing to be done about it.
Yeah, well, hey, I'll even say a year ago, I'd never set foot in Gainesville, Florida. When Ben called me about the job, I didn't even know where Gainesville was in the state of Florida on the map. But we've, my family and I have quickly come to love the place. It's a very family friendly, kind of small Southern college town. So, so we're very happy there, and may not be for everyone, but certainly for those who come, people who arrive in Gainesville find it a well kept secret, and often stay.
That's I will. In fairness, I will say that's what several other people have told me who have made the move down there. So there is that.
Yeah.
All right. Will Inboden, thanks again for doing this, and everyone should get the book Peacemaker and check out Madison Center and Hamilton Center and the University of Florida.
Thanks so much, Jonah. I really enjoyed it.